Hi, I'm Atomicus from OWKings.com, and today I'll talk about Pharah on Nepal. Anything from team compositions to different engagement angles and whatnot. As of yet, Pharah works against certain compositions, primarily ones that don't have that many hitscan heroes such as McCree, Widowmaker, and Soldier 76. Before we continue, make sure you check out the main guide for Pharah since I'll skip the basic stuff about her in this video. We're going to start off on the village side of the map. The ideal path in this case is going up the hill to the left and apply pressure towards the enemy team as soon as you are above this house. The concussive blast and jump jet will allow you to reach your position faster than the enemy, especially if you have a Lucio that can provide a speed boost for your team at the start of the round. Once you are above the house, you should just bombard the opposite doorway on the high ground so you can punish the enemy team if they're going to use that choke point initially. If they have a Reinhardt, try to aim slightly behind him to potentially force him to walk backwards into the house in order for him to protect his teammates from your rockets. If the enemy team chooses to go through the main entrance, then you have already gained a big high ground advantage, especially since you're playing Pharah. In this case, you can just rotate towards the point using the high ground to your advantage to pick off any key targets behind or around the point. Once you have control of the point, your team should already be positioned on the high ground. This will allow you to respond quite fast to any choke point when the enemy pushes in. You can also peek over the houses to scout what the enemy team is doing. If you know a key target is about to respawn, you can use this to your advantage to try to snipe him from above the house with some precise rockets. In terms of flanking, when it comes to holding the point, you can wait for the enemy team to push in and then just fly over the houses and flank them as you see fit. Make sure they don't spot you, otherwise your job will become much harder. Try to sync with your team by flanking when the enemy team has passed the choke point so that you can get supported once you show up behind the enemies. If they don't have any shields to protect them in the choke points, you can just sit on the high ground and spam away without any problems. Otherwise, just try flanking. When you have the barrage up, the best way to position yourself for an easy team kill is right above the choke points. You can just hover in the corner and wait for the enemy to push right through and then unleash your wrath upon them. Now, in the case of you losing the point and having to retake it, there are two ways of approaching this as Pharah. One is by flying above the house on the left side, so you can try to contest the high ground from the enemy team. Though you'll need the team to support you if the enemy has any heroes that can deal with you. The second one is by flanking from the right side and getting on the high ground above the point while your team goes directly on the point, which should force the enemy team to drop from the high ground and defend their point. This should be the right moment for you to deal with anybody on the high ground and then assist your team afterwards. So overall, the basics for this map are the following. Don't go through houses unless you know they're clear or you can deal with whoever is inside of them. Use the roofs to your advantage, either to flank the enemy team or to pick a key target that's separated from the rest of the enemy team. Spam the choke points whenever you know the enemy is about to push through them. And lastly, use your barrage near the choke points or on key targets on the high ground when you're contesting them. Of course, if you do have someone to combo with, such as a Zarya, Reinhardt, or Mei, you should always go for that. Moving on to another side of the map, we've got the Sanctum, which is similar to the village in terms of choke points, except that here you have the possibility of knocking people into the pit with your concussive blast. Alright, so the initial fight is always going to happen near the pillars since it provides a nice high ground advantage towards the area around the point. In this case, you can either spam the enemy shield together with your team so you can break it and then continue to damage them from afar, or you can fly above and flank them if you're going for a dive composition. You can also try to use your concussive blast here to knock someone into the pit, ideally the Reinhardt. Initially, this is the best angle to work with to accomplish that. Once you have control of the point, you can hold aggressively around the choke point that's closest to the enemy's respawn point. The same tips from the village can also be applied here, except that you can't fly over the choke points. Therefore, you should be careful so you don't get caught inside these small spaces. You should also pay attention to see if the enemy will flank from the other two small entrances. If you don't want to hold aggressively, you can just sit back near the pillars or on this wall next to the point. From here, you can also just fly across the point and you can use your concussive blast to push some people into the pit. Basically, just spam the choke points from afar and use the flank paths above the point and the pillars to get behind the enemy team. Now, when you don't have the point under your control, ideally you should flank from outside while your team pushes towards the pillars. If your team is stuck in the initial choke point, then try to assist them. In this case, you can also spam the doorways here and make space for your team to push in towards the point. Lastly, you should try to avoid this room and the one under it since there isn't much space to work with as Pharah. In terms of your ultimate usage, same rules apply for this map as well. Use it in your choke points, key targets, or combine it with the heroes that have synergy with you. Next up we have the last part of Nepal, which is the shrine. This side of the map is quite different from the other two, primarily because there's a lot of open space here, which is awesome for Pharah. Unfortunately, a lot of open space also means higher potential for the hit scan heroes, so you should be extra careful if they have any in the first place. So initially, there's plenty of paths to take with Pharah here. Usually, the first fight will happen on the point with some people near the elephant statue. Sometimes, some people will be on the opposite side, near the gate. Because of this, the best way to go about it is to fly above the point using the roof as cover while you're flanking whatever side you prefer. From here you can go behind any side depending on what you're expecting from the enemy team. You can also just go directly on the point and fly under the roof, though this is much riskier and it will expose you quite a lot. Another option is flanking this way, which will take longer and also expose you, so overall, depending on what the enemy team has and their positioning, you can use any of these available paths accordingly. Once you have the point, you can hold aggressively on either side. This side will allow you to cover both the main entrance and the room here. If they decide to push in, you can fly above and punish them from behind. You can also use the concussive blast to push some people off the map if they decide to push through the room. The other side is on the high ground, and you'll be able to cover the main entrance and the room here. You can also hear if the enemy decides to push through the room under you, unless they're sneaking. Either way, you have the high ground, so you should be able to deal a great amount of damage from here. Don't forget that you can use the roofs to your advantage here as well. For holding passively, you can use the statue as cover while you're spamming the main entrance, and if they decide to push from the other side, you can use the roof here to just flank and get behind them. Now comes the tough part, and that is when you don't have the point under your control and you have to retake it. The problem in this case is that the enemy can position themselves wherever they want, including the spots that you are using while defending. Keeping that in mind, you won't be able to fly towards the point without heavily exposing yourself. One way of dealing with this is by going through this room and then flying around the point, though you will need to be careful for any players that are on the high ground. The priorities in this scenario is retaking the high ground if they have anybody around here. The other way of reaching the point directly while being safe is by pushing together with a Reinhardt behind his shield, up until you can fly to the roof above the point and then use it as cover to move around. This will work if the enemy team doesn't have any heroes on the high ground or on either side of the main entrance. If they do, then you'll have to try to deal with these after initially going through the main entrance. So overall, plenty of ways to go on this map with Pharah, but also plenty of ways for Pharah to get easily denied, so keep that in mind while playing Pharah on this side of Nepal. A friendly reminder as always, if you are heavily contested by hitscan heroes and you feel like you can't do anything anymore, then it's time to swap the hero to something else. On Village and Sanctum, it's easier to use the choke points and cover to deal with those pesky hitscan heroes. However, on the Shrine side, it's much harder due to the amount of open space around the point. Alright, that covers Nepal for Pharah. I hope that you have learned some new things from this video, and as always, have a good one. Take care.